All right, let's jump right into this explainer and unpack a seriously fascinating and honestly kind of unsettling concept from Malcolm Gladwell about how we interact with people we don't know. Think about it. Throughout human history, our basic social survival has depended on reading the people around us. But what happens when those people are absolute strangers? Today, we're exploring a deeply uncomfortable idea, which is that we are fundamentally ill-equipped to understand the thoughts, the intentions, and the behaviors of the strangers we bump into every single day. To really grasp this, we're going to start in July 2015. Picture the raw tension of a visceral, tragic traffic stop in rural Texas. We're talking about a situation that started with a simple, everyday failure to signal a lane change and somehow spiraled into a life-altering disaster. We really need to look closely at this moment because it serves as the ultimate haunting test case for everything we're going to explore today. So who was involved here? On one side, we have Sandra Bland, a 28-year-old African-American woman who had just landed a great new job at her alma mater, Prairie View A&M. On the other side is Brian Encina, a 30-year-old white police officer. Bland was pulled over on the highway right outside the campus. And at first, the interaction was totally routine. Encina asked questions, Bland answered them. But then, Bland lit a cigarette, Encina asked her to put it out, and in an instant, the entire interaction just completely broke down.
The verbatim dash cam transcript is wild because it reveals the exact second communication collapses. When the officer tells her to step out of the car, Bland questions his authority to do so over a minor traffic ticket. She asserts her rights, basically saying, hey, I don't have to put out my cigarette in my own car, and I don't have to step out. But instead of de-escalating, the communication totally fractures. They're talking at each other, sure, but neither of them is truly hearing or translating the other person's reality.
And things escalate so incredibly fast. It becomes this uncomfortable, messy overlap of arguments. Encina reaches into the car, Bland yells at him not to touch her, Encina instantly calls for backup. It demonstrates with terrifying clarity how quickly two strangers can spiral into a worst-case scenario. It's a literal collision of assumptions and misread intentions playing out in real time on the side of a rural highway. This exchange climaxes with a catastrophic failure of translation between two strangers. Encina draws his stun gun, points it right at Bland and shouts, "I will light you up." Sandra Bland was pulled from her car, arrested, and thrown in jail. Tragically, just 3 days later, she committed suicide in her cell. A completely routine, everyday encounter ended in the absolute worst way imaginable.
Now, to really understand this, we have to zoom out and look at the context of that era. This happened during a very tense interlude in American public life. It was a time heavily marked by high-profile cases of police violence against black people, names that sparked massive protests and dominated the news cycle for years. Michael Brown in Ferguson, Freddie Gray in Baltimore, Philando Castile in Minnesota, Eric Garner in New York, Walter Scott in South Carolina. Sandra Bland's tragedy became a huge part of this massive national conversation.
So how did society actually debate this string of tragedies? Well, the public response pretty much split into two camps. One side looked at the forest from 10,000 feet up, arguing that these encounters were the direct result of pervasive, systemic racism and prejudice. The other side, though, looked at the trees with a magnifying glass, focusing on the specific incompetence, training failures, or just bad actions of individual officers.
Now, in this explainer, we aren't here to take a political side in that debate. Obviously, both prejudice and incompetence are very real factors in societal dysfunction. But instead, we're going to use Gladwell's framing to ask a completely different question. What if both of those perspectives are actually missing a deeper, fundamental flaw in human communication? What if there is something inherently broken in the very mechanics of how we talk to people we don't know? To truly grasp this flaw, we actually need to rewind the clock about 500 years to the 16th century. See, for the vast majority of human history, encounters were rarely between absolute strangers. Even when nations went to war, they fought their neighbors. They fought people who historically understood each other's rules, cultures, religions, and battle tactics. They already knew the context of the people they were dealing with. But that paradigm? It completely shattered in 1519. When the Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés marched into the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan to meet the ruler Montezuma II, it was an entirely unprecedented encounter. The Spanish were just awestruck by this floating city, the spotlessly clean boulevards, the immaculate temples. But the true shock was that neither side knew absolutely anything about the other. No European had ever been to Mexico. No Aztec had ever seen a European, let alone their weird weapons or horses. They were total, unmitigated strangers. Imagine trying to have a high-stakes conversation through a literally impossible game of telephone.
When Cortés wanted to speak to Montezuma, he couldn't just talk to him. He spoke in Spanish to a priest named Aguilar, who had happened to learn Mayan during a shipwreck. Aguilar then translated the Spanish into Mayan for an Indian woman named Malinche. Malinche then translated that Mayan into the Aztec language Nahuatl for Montezuma. And for Montezuma to reply, that entire exhausting chain had to run in reverse.
What really doomed them was a massive cultural mismatch. In the Aztec language, powerful rulers used what is called a reverential mode. Basically, it was a cultural tradition of elaborate false humility. A powerful leader would purposefully speak of himself as small and weak just to draw attention to the fact that he was actually esteemed and powerful. To give you an idea, the Nahuatl word for noble is almost exactly the same as the word for child.
As historian Matthew Restall points out, the speaker was often obliged to say the opposite of what was really meant. So Montezuma gives this grand speech, full of that rich cultural nuance, but stripped of all its context through multiple translators, the meaning was flipped entirely upside down. The Spanish mistakenly thought Montezuma believed Cortés was a returning, exiled deity, and that Montezuma was officially surrendering his magnificent city to them. The fallout from this fundamental inability to understand a stranger? Apocalyptic. Montezuma was taken hostage and murdered. The two sides went to war, and the immaculate city of Tenochtitlan was utterly destroyed. Up to 20 million Aztecs perished from the violence and introduced diseases. But beyond the immediate tragedy of it all, this encounter ushered in our modern pattern of social interaction. From then on, we were no longer just dealing with our neighbors.
Fast forward to the Cold War era, and we see this stranger problem still persisting, but this time in the exact place it absolutely shouldn't, among professionals explicitly trained to deceive and detect deception. Enter Florentino Aspalaga. He was a star Cuban intelligence officer, so highly regarded he actually had a handwritten commendation from Fidel Castro himself. But by 1987, stationed in Bratislava, he had grown deeply disenchanted with Castro's arrogance and the regime as a whole. Aspalaga plans this insanely daring defection. On a random Saturday afternoon, he met up with his girlfriend Marta, whose passport was held by the Cuban government, by the way, and executed a bold escape. He took the spare tire out of the trunk of his government-issued Mazda, drilled an air hole right in the floor, had her climb inside, and drove straight through the heavily restricted border guards who recognized his diplomatic status, making his way all the way to Vienna.
He just rolls up to the U.S. Embassy gates in Vienna as what the spy trade calls a walk-in, shocking the guards by announcing exactly who he was. He brought secrets regarding Cuba and the Soviet Union that were so sensitive, the Cuban spy service repeatedly tried to assassinate him in the years that followed. But the crazy takeaway here is that even within the absolute highest echelons of global intelligence, where their entire job is to read strangers, massive deceptions go completely unnoticed until someone willingly walks through the front door.
So, what is the crucial thread connecting the Spanish conquest, a Cold War defector, and a Texas highway? It's this. The modern world is not just two neighbors feuding anymore. Modern society constantly forces us into high-stakes interactions with absolute strangers, people whose assumptions, backgrounds, and perspectives are totally alien to our own. Yet, despite this constant exposure, we stubbornly lack the tools to accurately translate their words and intentions. We approach strangers as if they are transparent, and it fails us time and time again.
When we look back at the haunting tragedy of Sandra Bland by the side of that road, we really have to recognize the immense difficulty of what was happening there. They were strangers, trying to read each other across a massive divide of race, gender, profession, and power, without the necessary tools to do so. And it leaves us with a profound, lingering challenge to carry forward. If our default strategies for reading people are this broken, how do we finally learn to make sense of strangers?